For those of us who might not have met you yet, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work and your interests and your research?
My name is Laury Oaks. I'm professor and chair in the Department of Feminist Studies at UC Santa Barbara. I've been here for a number of years, and my academic background is actually in cultural anthropology and public health. And I've had a focus on sexual and reproductive politics, and that's what brought me into feminist studies. Overall, I'm really fascinated by the power of health-related social movements. And I'm really fortunate to be a tenured professor here at UC Santa Barbara in feminist studies because I get a chance to work with interdisciplinary scholars and scholars who are really invested in intersectional social justice scholar activism. One of the groups that I've been working with for several years now is the UC Global Health Institute's Women, Health, Gender and Empowerment Center of Expertise. So that's one of the UC alphabet soup kinds of things. So I work with the UCGHI on the Signature Project, which, as you know about through SASA, is UC Speaks Up. And perhaps you don't know that this has an international component also. So right now we're reviewing grant applications that are submitted to the International Pilot Grant Program to support universities in other parts of the world who are doing evidence-based policy work around campus sexual violence. So that's a really exciting part of that project. Also, I'm part of the Feminist Futures Initiative, and that is something that is run out of the Division of Social Sciences at UCSB. It's supported by Dean Charlie Hale, and it's led by Associate Dean and Feminist Studies Professor Lila Roop. And so for Feminist Futures Initiative, there's an advisory board of social sciences faculty, and we're envisioning what we're trying to build toward is a future Feminist Futures Center. And our idea of the Feminist Futures is to bring together high school students, undergrads, graduate students, hopefully postdocs someday, and faculty to address whatever the pressing social justice movement issues are in our society and globally. So one thing that we did that's related to SASA's work is in winter quarter, this past winter quarter, in collaboration with Arts and Lectures and a variety of other people on campus, we brought Anita Hill to campus, and Lila and Charlie were really instrumental in that. So we had opportunities for youth to talk to her, and then 2 feminist studies graduate students were on the stage in Campbell Hall they were selected to ask Anita Hill questions. So that was like a really momentous and energizing kind of event. And then also in winter quarter through Feminist Futures, I organized for 2 graduate students, Sierra Soren, who's at UC Santa Barbara, and Brittany Bloom, who's a grad student in a program that's through UCSD and San Diego State in public health. And they presented their own research. Sierra presented it from her project that's called Me Too Grad School. And then Brittany presented her work from research that's part of the UC Speaks Up project. So they were emphasizing particularly the distinct needs of graduate students because we found that there's very little research or campus interventions that specifically are targeting grad students. So in this forum, it was fantastic because powerful administrators from UCSB were up on stage to respond to the presentations that they gave. And then we had a reception to develop those ideas and connections further. So I'm working on a number of other projects, but for me, these are highlights because they really show the benefits of collaborative feminist research, and that is really what's most rewarding to me.
So you mentioned UC Speaks Up a little bit while you were talking about the projects you were doing. So I know this past year you led and organized a research team to collect data within UCSB for this program. So for those of us who might not have heard of UC Speaks Up, could you tell us a little more about what this initiative is, what its goals are, and how the program plans to achieve those goals?
Yeah. So this again is through the UC GHI, the Global Health Institute, and our goal was to create a signature project that we could all collaborate around throughout the UC system. So what ended up happening, as you know, is that 3 campuses, UCLA, UCSD, and UC Santa Barbara, and I would say probably that's because that's where people were most interested and active at the time when we were building this up. So beginning in January of 2019, I was a primary investigator for just the UCSB component. And I was really happy to be able to work with a team of a graduate student and undergraduates, some of course you know. And the goal was really the goal at each of the campuses is to move forward evidence-based interventions that are grounded in public health approaches. And of course, I don't see a public health approach, in my view, as separate from a feminist approach. So in our campus at UCSB, we're very attentive to intersectionality and other things that are central to feminist studies, and are also addressed in public health in a different way. But so our idea is that to reach administrators, sometimes the public health approach is something that's really seen as acceptable and fundable. And what we want to be able to do is to apply the evidence-based interventions to entire campuses so that we can prevent sexual violence and harassment and also support survivors. So right now we're at the stage of publishing articles, presenting data at conferences. Some of them now will have to be virtual conferences, and then also doing presentations on our campuses.
Why was it so important for this team to interview people from such different sectors of UCSB's institution, especially with a lot of studies on college campuses really focusing on undergrads?
I'm so glad you recognize that. It's a great question. And indeed, our view, and perhaps it is something that is from a public health and a feminist understanding of institutions, that there are a variety of players and constituents in any one institution. And then we see that even in UC campuses, like there are differences of how power operates, what are the channels of communication and administrative oversight. But at our campus, we know that, UC Santa Barbara is a social justice campus. And so we know that there perhaps is more collaboration or more awareness of how interconnected we are. At some of the campuses, they have medical schools and other professional schools that are kind of standalone, and they create a lot of spread. But indeed, UC Speaks Up on those campuses did interview people who were graduate students and undergrads, say, who were in a school of public health or medical school. But here on our campus and across our project, the qualitative methods are really to capture diversities of individuals' lives and also to capture how their experiences are shaped by where they are in the university structure. So the different sectors of the university are perceiving experiences of sexual violence, assault, and harassment, as well as education and prevention differently based on who they are. And the challenges that we face in terms of getting let's call it, evenly distributed education prevention responses, particularly we can see in the graduate student case that, as you say, a lot of the research is on undergraduates. And the graduate students' quality of life is really important for their own lives, for departments, and also for their undergraduate lives. But what we're trying to do is to say, like, well, even if there aren't as large number of graduate students on our campus, that is one constituency that we really need to focus on. So then we can take something like staff. So for staff who are experiencing sexual violence or harassment, it's a whole different channel of how the university responds to that. But we also need to cast the net very wide to try to understand what are the ways in which interventions are needed for staff as distinct from undergrads, grad students, faculty, staff, and postdocs. So there's something about qualitative methods that can really get to the texture of the differences, because it's about what are people's experiences and what are their perceptions of what is even possible. However, I have to say that doing this kind of research, we experienced some barriers, and some of them we could work with. So for example, we were challenged with our original vision was a very broad vision. So we had the idea that we were going to seek funding for a UC-wide campus climate survey. This means that we wanted to be able to design a survey that was specific to each individual campus, but would gather data that we could compare across campuses in order to have more collaboration and with funding and research and resources that are evidence-based to roll out on those campuses. Now, as you know, UC Berkeley was ahead of this because they actually were mandated to do a campus climate survey, but we looked at their materials and they were really excellent. So at UC Santa Barbara, we even started to modify and adapt those materials. However, what we found is that funding was not supported either at campus levels, including UCSB's campus, or at the UC level, because we applied for funding that was a multi-campus funding project. So because doing a campus climate survey takes a lot more resources, that's another like practical reason why we turn to qualitative methods, because qualitative methods we could implement without the huge amount of funding that we would need to do a UC-wide campus survey.
Would you be able to talk about some of the results that you found and some of the patterns you've seen, especially among the different groups that we have on campuses?
So I can speak a little bit. We're at the process where we are still analyzing. You can imagine with 3 campuses with all the focus group and in-depth interview data that it's a lot to manage. COVID-19 didn't help at all in our organizations, but so we're trying to get it together. So the team is focusing on a variety of areas. So at UCLA, there's a team that's leading in focusing on athletics, because UCLA, of course, is a major athletic institution, and we know that sexual violence has been a real problem and had increased visibility and legal responses in that area. So they're working on that. But what our goal really is to not just look at each individual campus, but look across campuses as we're working on presentations, publishing, and policy recommendations. So the one I can speak to most closely is the paper that I'm working on with Sierra Soren and Brittany Bloom and Jennifer Wagman, who used to be at UCSD and now is at UCLA in the School of Public Health, working on these issues. So it goes back to that Feminist Futures Forum where we're talking about graduate students in particular. So part of what we are really interested in is, at the same time that we're faced with the COVID-19 emergency and we're witnessing the movement that's really dynamic, that's addressing the cost of living with the graduate student movement, we're at a time where there are rapid changes. It seems like it's really ideal for us to focus our current campus events on graduate students and their needs, with the argument that we know that they are very precarious and that caring for our grad students really enhances the education for undergrads. So I'm hoping on our campus we continue to build some grad undergrad along with staff and faculty kinds of collaborations. So Brittany and Sierra and I are meeting with our Zoom meetings to try to pull together a manuscript that is really looking at not just graduate students as a homogenous group, because of course they are not. There are very different pressures along the lines that we think about in feminist studies having to do with LGBTQ issues. We know that undocumented students have their own different kinds of pressures. We know that students who are doing field work on teams, for example, in anthropology, if they're doing archaeology. We also know that graduate students have different mentoring relationships with their faculty members, and that oftentimes their funding is related to the research that the faculty member is doing. This is particularly a model in the STEM fields. There's also the laboratory part of in a lab that opens up a range of challenges for graduate students to navigate. So right now what we're trying to do in this paper is to draw out what are those types of differences pressures on graduate students, and how can we connect to the literature that it isn't very much literature, but try to build the literature up that can address grad students in their diversities in that way. And then also we do have data that we can return to that will focus on undergraduates. We first were envisioning a paper that was going to look at undergrads and grads, and then it seemed like that wasn't, it didn't make sense really, because the lived experiences, the resources, and the challenges are very different for those two groups. And then we realized that there just wasn't much written on grad students, so that's why we shifted to that.
So I know that a lot of this work has been very broad in terms of kind of strata you've been examining, like from faculty to staff to grad students and undergrads, but also in the diversity within those strata. So what would you say to people who might not be part of the UC Speaks Up initiative in UCSD and UCLA and UCSB, but want to take on a project like this, but are intimidated by how many moving parts there have to be, how broad it's going to be?
Well, that's a good point. So I think any kind of collaborative research requires some core organizing folks. And those core organizers, borrowing on, say, community-based participatory research methods, the core organizing people should have connections to different constituents on campus. So if you have your preliminary research where you know who is being most affected, and you know who you want to get your information from, that in depth or in breadth. So I think that it would be important for folks to not step out alone to do this kind of research, to have a core that is going to be viable, say maybe for 2 years, because this kind of research doesn't move very fast. And then also to anticipate what some of the road bumps might be, and then try to address them as best you can. So you were saying, like, how do you organize on 3 different campuses or a number of different campuses? Because you're right, that is a lot of moving parts, because every campus is going to be different. So you can't even roll out a plan that says, okay, everybody, we're going to go on and all interview, I don't know, administrators who are in diversity and equity office. Because, for example, on our campus, we don't have somebody in that position right now. So you're going to have to take into account doing kind of a survey amongst yourselves as the core organizing group to compare the differences, and then try to have some kind of plan moving forward. But I think that a key is like core organizers who are committed to intersectionality, who are committed to social justice, that you have a shared mission, that you can all move forward, and that you can have really specific goals. So in CBPR, community-based participatory research that I participated in before, one of the things that we really had to work in were goals throughout the project, because we found that our community organizers had a lot of fatigue. If in the academic model, you gather a whole bunch of information, you analyze that information, and then you have some results, and that just was not legitimate or valued by our community members. So this was an LGBTQ project. So what we did instead is very rapidly, we had to say, okay, well, what are our milestones or what are our goals throughout the project? So then, of course, you get to celebrate things as you're moving along through your project, and you're not just waiting and waiting till the end of it. So that's important. And I've seen that happen through the UC Speaks Up project too.
And thanks so much for not only for interviewing, but also just for all the work you've done as part of UC Speaks Up for Feminist Futures. SASA really appreciates everything that you and your teams and your collaborators have been working on.
Great. Well, thank you, Vince. I really appreciate SASA, and I know that these are really challenging times right now, so it's fantastic that you're all getting together and doing these interviews. I look forward to seeing how that all works out.